Henry Fonda's daughter finally speaks out. You know Henry Fonda as a handsome hero, the all-American good guy, a legend of Hollywood's golden age. But what if I told you that was all an act? The real Henry Fonda was a troubled man with a messy personal life. He could barely hold back tears on set, yet he shattered his children's hearts at home. He could be the best friend in the world one day, and brutally betray his closest pal the next. And the women in his life? Well, let's just say it wasn't all happily ever afters. Get ready, because the true face of Henry Fonda is way more complicated than you ever imagined. Rise from obscurity. Henry Fonda's childhood sounds like something out of a strange novel. He was born in Nebraska way back in 1905, and his parents belonged to a super strict religious group called Christian Science. The whole idea was that you shouldn't rely on doctors, but instead heal yourself and deal with problems on your own. Now, you can imagine this wasn't exactly the best setup for a young kid like Henry. Early on, it was clear something was different. He was way more awkward than most boys, short for his age, and so shy it was painful. His family's lifestyle didn't give him much chance to practice talking to people he didn't know, especially girls. Forget about flirting. He barely even looked at them, unless it was his sisters. All that shyness meant he bottled up his feelings, which, as you might guess, caused a whole mess of problems later on. Well, his early adult years were actually pretty normal. He played sports, helped his dad at the family print shop, and even went to college studying journalism at the University of Minnesota. So far, so ordinary. Then, boom, everything changed. Around his early 20s, Henry shot up to a solid 6 feet tall. The awkwardness faded, replaced by good looks. Suddenly, the Omaha Community Playhouse came calling, and it set his life on a totally new course. This was where Fonda found himself, and it all started with a little push from an unlikely source. Joy Brand, the mother of future legend Marlon Brando, was the one who convinced him to audition. Turns out, Henry had some serious talent. The stage was like his second home. Fonda didn't just dabble at the Omaha Community Playhouse. He went full-on obsessed. He dove into everything, from building sets to running the whole production. But here's the weird part. While it was obvious he was seriously gifted, acting made him uncomfortable. He hated the attention, felt embarrassed whenever he was on stage. The only way he could get through a performance was by losing himself completely in the character he was playing, basically pretending to be someone else. Not the healthiest way to deal with his talent, but Fonda was determined. No way was he going to let a little thing like stage fright stop him from becoming a star. Tinseltown Trials. In 1928, he packed his bags and headed east to join a famous theater group called the University Players. This was the big leagues of regional theater, and Fonda was finally getting real professional acting jobs. But guess what? While his acting career was taking off, his love life was heating up too. At the University Players, Fonda met a fiery actress named Margaret Sullivan, who would become a Hollywood star herself someday. This wasn't your typical teenage crush. Fonda was smitten head over heels for Margaret. He wooed her, charmed her, and before you knew it, he was down on one knee proposing. No more awkward teenage boy here. Fonda was a confident young man, and Margaret fell for him hard. They were young and passionate, the kind of couple who made grand romantic gestures. Crazy in love, they decided to get married on Christmas Day in 1931. Margaret was barely in her 20s, and Fonda was just 26. It seemed like a picture-perfect Hollywood romance, but they were also pretty clueless when it came to making a marriage work. Fonda was used to hiding his feelings, while Margaret had a temper and wasn't afraid to show it. It was a recipe for disaster, and the explosion happened sooner rather than later. One 4th of July, they were having a nice dinner when Margaret decided she didn't want to pay for fireworks. Fonda, instead of talking to her about it, made some snarky comment to another actor, right in front of her. Margaret, being Margaret, absolutely lost it. She grabbed a pitcher of ice water and dumped it right over Fonda's head. Even worse, Fonda didn't even react. He just silently got up and left. Margaret stayed at the table and finished her dinner, like nothing happened. Seriously, how awkward was that night? It's the perfect example of how badly these two were mismatched. You can almost hear the marriage shattering along with that pitcher of ice water. But Fonda and Margaret gave it their best shot. They even packed up for New York City to try and make things work. But their marriage was like a house of cards. It didn't last long. Sadly, after only 2 months, they were calling it quits. The honeymoon period was barely over before they were living separate lives. You'd think after this dramatic failure, Fonda would have learned something, right? Wrong. The messy split actually kicked off one of the wildest, most scandalous phases of his life. He was a single guy, ready to party, and he had the perfect partner in crime. Soon after the divorce, Fonda moved in with another rising star, a fellow small-town boy named Jimmy Stewart. These two were like a whirlwind. They became inseparable friends and quickly developed a reputation as the ultimate lady killers. They did everything together, and in 1935, they both packed their bags and headed for Hollywood. This was a game changer for Fonda. Back in New York, he was barely scraping by. But in Hollywood, the land of dreams, he landed a starring role in a movie called The Farmer Takes a Wife. Can you believe it? Suddenly, he and Jimmy were rubbing shoulders with movie stars, wining and dining the beautiful actress Carole Lombard, and even living next door to the legendary Greta Garbo. Hollywood wasn't just about work for Fonda, though. Love seemed to be in the air, too. In 1936, he got married again, this time to a glamorous socialite named Frances Ford Seymour Brokaw. Here's the thing. Frances had just lost her husband and was still heartbroken. Not exactly the best foundation for a happy marriage, right? Especially since Fonda, with his whole keeping emotions bottled up thing, wasn't exactly the most supportive husband. It was a recipe for disaster. Even though Fonda really wanted to be a good family man, this marriage wouldn't be easy. They had 2 children together, Jane and Peter Fonda, who both became famous actors themselves. Fonda even tried to be there for the birth of his daughter Jane, taking a break from filming his big movie Jezebel. For a while, things seemed to be falling into place for Fonda. His career was soaring. He went from a promising newcomer to a serious Hollywood star. By the time he landed his iconic role in the 1940 classic The Grapes of Wrath, Fonda was a force to be reckoned with. He even fought tooth and nail to get the part, beating out the more established Tyrone Power. He was officially a big shot, earning an Oscar nomination for his performance. Then it all came crashing down in the early 1940s. War and remorse. World War II turned everything upside down. Even Hollywood stars couldn't ignore the chaos, and Fonda felt a deep sense of duty. He wasn't the type to sit on the sidelines. With little hesitation, he left behind his Hollywood life and his young family to join the fight. "I don't want to be in a fake war in a studio," he famously declared. It was a brave decision, but it came at a huge cost. When Fonda returned from the horrors of war, he wasn't the same man. He had become hardened, distant, a shell of his old self. His family bore the brunt of this transformation. Fonda still struggled with expressing his emotions. If he felt his wife and children needed too much from him, he could have terrifying, explosive outbursts. It was a pattern, a cycle of fear and repression echoing his own childhood. The scars of this behavior would haunt his children long into adulthood. His son Peter claimed his father never said, "I love you," or hugged him until Fonda was much older. Jane, his daughter, faced a different kind of emotional burden. She admits that her father instilled in her a toxic belief: unless you look perfect, you won't be loved. Fonda wasn't exactly father of the year, but things were even worse with his wife, Frances. Remember how she was still grieving her first husband when they married? Turns out, Frances also struggled with bipolar disorder. Living with that kind of emotional turmoil on top of Fonda's inability to express himself, it was a recipe for disaster. Fonda was deeply unhappy, and things spiraled. He cheated on Frances with a much younger socialite named Susan Blanchard. Not exactly a stand-up move. Then, in 1949, after over a decade of a miserable marriage, Fonda dropped a bombshell on Frances. He wanted a divorce, and to twist the knife further, he told her he wanted to be free to marry his mistress. Imagine how Frances felt: betrayed, heartbroken, and completely lost. The emotional toll was devastating. Less than 6 months later, she was so distraught she checked herself into a psychiatric hospital for treatment. Fonda's coldness had a real human cost, and Frances was left to pick up the pieces. Sadly, Frances' story takes a heartbreaking turn. On April 14, 1950, just 10 days after her 42nd birthday, while still under treatment at the psychiatric hospital, she committed suicide. This news must have been a devastating blow to Fonda, a father left to face the tragic consequences of his actions and the impact on his 2 young children. Fonda's daughter Jane was only 12, his son Peter just 10 when their mother died. Thinking he was protecting them, he spun a terrible lie, claiming their mother had died from a heart condition. Maybe a parent's instinct to shield your children from pain is understandable, but what happened next is far more difficult to comprehend. Fonda was never one for messy emotions, and he took this instinct to the extreme. Fearful of his children's grief, he didn't even let them attend their mother's funeral. Instead, He organized a small, private ceremony just for himself and his mother-in-law. The scars from this betrayal would run deep. But wait, Fonda's cruelty towards his family wasn't over yet. To ensure his children would never find out about their mother's suicide, he canceled all newspaper and magazine subscriptions to their house. Talk about extreme measures. Despite all his efforts to hide the truth, it eventually came out. Jane, a young girl searching for some understanding of her mother's death, stumbled upon the truth while flipping through a magazine in a school study hall. It's hard to imagine the shock and confusion she must have felt. You'd think the tragic loss of Francis Brokaw would make Fonda reconsider his choices. Nope. Less than a year later, he did exactly what he had been planning the whole time. He married his 21-year-old mistress, Susan Blanchard. To complete the happy family picture, they even adopted a daughter, Amy Fishman, 3 years later. Unfortunately, Amy's story reveals that underneath Fonda's picture-perfect life, the cracks were starting to show. The price of perfection. As years passed, disturbing details began to surface about Fonda's third marriage. Susan, still a young woman, felt stifled by the seriousness of motherhood and marriage, but there were even bigger problems lurking beneath the surface. She accused Fonda of expecting her to be like a geisha, a perfectly polished figure who would shield him from anything unpleasant. It sounds like Fonda never really shed that habit of bottling up his emotions and expecting those around him to cater to his need for control. This third marriage was doomed from the start, but Fonda's life was about to crumble in another way, professionally. For years, he'd collaborated with the legendary Western director John Ford, creating iconic films like My Darling Clementine in 1946. The two shared a close friendship, but that was all about to change. While filming Mr. Roberts, a war film set to be another big hit, Fonda found himself at the center of a brutal, heartbreaking feud. Things went downhill fast on the set of Mr. Roberts. From day one, sparks flew between Fonda and director John Ford, who wasn't exactly known for his sunny personality. Ford clashed with another actor, James Cagney, who later called him a nasty old man. Yikes. And soon enough, Ford set his sights on Fonda, his once good friend. One day, things boiled over in a truly shocking way. Ford got so mad he actually decked Fonda, punched him right in the face. There's no coming back from something like that. Fonda was done, finished with Ford as a friend and director. Even when Ford apologized, it was too late. Fonda wouldn't give him another chance. By 1956, Fonda's life was a mess. His marriage to Susan was over, just 3 years after they adopted a child. He was in full-blown midlife crisis mode, but Fonda wasn't one to wallow for long. A few months later, he tied the knot again, this time to a glamorous Italian noblewoman with a name straight out of a storybook, the Baroness Afdera Franchetti. Can you imagine introducing that woman at a party? Now, Fonda and Jimmy Stewart were practically inseparable since their New York days. Remember, they were roommates, acting buddies, and partners in crime. But even the strongest friendships can be tested, and the 1960s threw a huge curveball their way. The 60s were a wild time, with tons of political arguments everywhere. Fonda, ever the liberal, leaned Democrat, while Jimmy Stewart was a solid Republican, on the other side of the aisle. You can imagine how that went over dinner. One night, things exploded between them. They got into a screaming match about politics that would make their old fights with their wives look like a walk in the park. It was a terrible blow-up, and it almost shattered their lifelong friendship. Somehow, they managed to pick up the pieces, but things were never quite the same. They made a pact. Politics was officially off limits, never to be spoken of again between them. That was a big blow, but hold on, because there's even more to this story. It turns out the political fight wasn't the darkest secret of their friendship. There was something even stranger lurking beneath the surface. In 1960, Fonda's first wife, Margaret Sullivan, passed away. Her daughter Brooke later published a shocking memoir about her mother's life, and it revealed a bombshell about Sullivan's marriage to Fonda. Turns out, everyone's favorite bromance between Fonda and Jimmy Stewart had a hidden side. It wasn't just Fonda who had feelings for Margaret. Apparently, Margaret was head over heels for Jimmy. According to Brooke, her mother had an affair with Stewart for a whole year while she was still married to Fonda. Talk about a twist. Now, for a totally different type of drama, let's talk about Fonda's famous role in the iconic film 12 Angry Men. We all know and love it, a classic courtroom drama where Fonda gives an unforgettable performance as the juror who passionately fights for justice. But here's something you might not know. When it first came out, the movie was a huge flop. Can you imagine? Fonda produced the movie too, and he was so disappointed, he swore to never ever produce a film again. Shows you even the best can stumble sometimes. Even heading into his late 60s and the 1970s, Fonda was a workhorse. The guy just couldn't slow down. Turns out, even the strongest work ethic has its limits. In 1974, while performing in a play, his body caught up with him. Fonda collapsed from pure exhaustion. But did that stop him? Of course not. This tough old guy got a pacemaker, and by the next year, he was back on that stage like nothing had happened. Then, something heartwarming happened. A project initiated by his daughter Jane. She bought the rights to a play called On Golden Pond, a story about a difficult relationship between an emotionally distant father and his daughter. Jane had a deeper reason for doing this. She hoped the play would help her and her father work through some of their own complicated feelings. Turns out she was right. One scene in particular hit close to home. Jane's character has a moment where she tells Henry's character she wants them to be friends. During a take that made it into the final cut, Jane spontaneously reached out and took her father's hand. This tender gesture caught Fonda off guard, and those famously stoic eyes filled with tears. It's proof that beneath the tough exterior, Henry Fonda did have a heart after all. On Golden Pond touched audiences everywhere. The movie raked in the money and earned a bunch of Oscar nominations, including one for Henry Fonda himself. Finally, in 1982, he got his hands on the Golden Statue, his first and only Oscar win. It was a triumph for Fonda, a lifetime of dedication recognized by the Academy. But even this glorious night had a dark cloud hanging over it. By the time the awards came around, Fonda was too old and sick to attend. Instead, his daughter Jane stepped in, giving a heartfelt speech in his place. I bet when he just heard it now, he said, "Hey, ain't I lucky?" as if luck had anything to do with it.
He said, "Hey, ain't I lucky?" As though luck had anything to do with it.
Jane said, her voice filled with pride on her father's behalf. Speaking of Jane, there's an interesting story about how she got into acting in the first place. She once asked her dad for advice about his acting methods. You'd think a legend like him would have tons to share, right? Wrong. Fonda got flustered, snapping, "I don't know. I stand there. I think about my wife. I don't know." Down his art tricky. And for all the women who swooned over him on screen, Fonda was spectacularly unlucky in love. His marriage to the Italian Baroness went downhill by 1961, just like the others before. He gave it one more shot in 1965, marrying his fifth wife, Shirley May Adams. This time it lasted, all the way until his later years. Seems like despite all the failed marriages, love eventually found a way for Fonda. Shocking revelations and legacy. As Henry Fonda aged and became a Hollywood veteran, his career wasn't slowing down one bit. In fact, it was getting even hotter. One of his most iconic roles to this day is the villain Frank in the classic Western flick Once Upon a Time in the West by director Sergio Leone. But this legendary performance almost never happened. Can you believe it? Fonda actually turned down the role at first, but the director wouldn't give up on his vision. He flew all the way from Italy to the United States just to convince Fonda to take the part. Luckily, Leone's persistence paid off, and Fonda eventually agreed. Here's a fun fact. Fonda originally had a plan to make his character Frank look even more evil. He brought contact lenses to set, wanting to hide his famous blue eyes and make him appear less innocent. Thankfully, Leone stepped in again. He convinced Fonda that the contrast between Frank's cruelty and those baby blues would be way more chilling, and he was absolutely right. Fonda's performance as Frank is now a gold standard for how to play a truly unforgettable villain. Henry Fonda's career was full of wild surprises. For example, did you know he missed out on a huge role? The director Sergio Leone wanted him to be the star of famous Western movies like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, but Fonda turned down the part, and it went to a young actor named Clint Eastwood instead. Fonda dealt with more than just missed opportunities. He also attracted some intense crushes from his female co-stars. While filming an older movie called Daisy Kenyon, his co-star Joan Crawford fell head over heels for him. She got the costume department to create a custom red sequin jockstrap, which she then presented to the star in a gift box. Being the strong, silent type, Fonda initially didn't even acknowledge Crawford's racy gift, so Crawford had to get creative. While they were doing a scene together where Fonda carried her up some stairs, she leaned in and asked him to model the underwear for her in private. As Fonda said when she whispered the invitation, "I nearly dropped her." Even after Frances Brokaw's tragic death, her ghost still lingered in Fonda's life. Before taking her own life, she wrote farewell letters to her loved ones. There was one glaring gap, not a single word for Fonda. To make matters worse, Frances' therapist at the hospital added another blow. Doctors are meant to be impartial. but this one had some harsh opinions about Fonda. She believed, based on her sessions with Francis, that he was a cold, self-obsessed narcissist. That's a brutal assessment of someone's character. Sadly, Fonda didn't have much time left after his big Oscar win. On August 12, 1982, he passed away at home, surrounded by his children and his last wife, Shirley. Staying true to his no-nonsense style, his last wish was to have no funeral service at all. Henry Fonda's story reminds us that even the brightest Hollywood stars have their struggles. His nickname, One Take Fonda, hinted at his effortless talent on screen, but his real life was far more complicated. He navigated messy relationships, a string of whirlwind marriages, and a tangled friendship with fellow icon Jimmy Stewart. The love triangle between Fonda, Stewart, and Margaret Sullivan only adds to the turbulent tale. The contrast between his public persona and private struggles paints a complex picture. He was an actor who, like his characters, faced both triumphs and heartbreaks. Henry Fonda's legacy is a testament to the fact that behind the glitz and glamour, even the greatest stars hide their shadows. His story leaves a lasting mark, not just on film history, but on our understanding of the human side of Hollywood. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the remarkable and sometimes scandalous life of Henry Fonda.